So there's been a lot of talk recently talking about Impact Wrestling and talking about contracts. Contracts are the thing that people like to talk about at the moment when it comes to Impact. Specifically, of course, Moose. Moose has been the subject of a lot of discussion about his Impact Wrestling contract. And of course, we know it expires next month in June. At least his original contract did. There was lots of discussion, certainly on this channel, but on social media and in lots of the Impact fan groups and between the Impact Wrestling fans discussing where is Moose going to go? What's going on with his contract? Is he going to go to WWE? Is he going to go to AEW? There was lots of discussion. Previously, I thought that he probably would go to WWE or AEW. That would certainly be a direction he would go in. Then, of course, we had the report come out that he was expected to stay in Impact Wrestling. It was reported by Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter and on F4WOnline.com that he was very close to signing a new deal. Possibly he'd even signed a new contract with Impact Wrestling. Very much at the least he was expected to stay. That was the discussion. Well, I thought what I would do today is kind of using the information that's out there on social media, giving the information that's out there in terms of when announcements were previously made about contracts, when they re-signed with the company, how long for, information that some stars have given in interviews and hints and all that kind of stuff. I thought what I would do is give a bit of an update as to some current stars, some major stars, and maybe for the next 12 months or so as to whose contracts are expiring soon on the Impact Wrestling roster, where I think they will go. Do I think they'll re-sign? What's going on, basically? I thought I would do something like that because it's certainly an interesting story. And with Impact, the contractual situation for a lot of people is very complicated. And I must state this, is that these are by the information that's out there. Things may have changed. Things may have not changed. Things may not be factually completely accurate here, but we're going off what was announced previously, whether it was a couple of years ago, a year ago, answers that we're giving in interviews, that kind of stuff there as well. So we're going to go through some big names, talking about when their contract expired, what do I think is going to happen next? And you can let me know your thoughts about them in the comment section below. It's a bit of a different video than what we would usually do here, but I think it's worth talking about. It's worth getting aware of, considering that these things could be becoming big stories in the near future. So let's start off with the first name, and that is Rich Swann. Rich Swann's contractual status in Impact Wrestling is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because as you can see on the screen there, Rich Swann's contract does expire in May of 2021. Now, it's interesting because we're towards the end of May at this point, so what's going on with Rich Swann's contract? To give you the simple answer, I don't know, and I don't think a lot of people know because not a lot of information is out there. As far as we can deduce at this point is Rich Swann has some form of an agreement with Impact Wrestling. We know that. We know that he has some form of an agreement with Impact Wrestling because he's still making appearances with the promotion. Now, of course, Rich Swann, former Impact World Champion, dropped the Impact World Championship to Kenny Omega back at Impact Rebellion back in April, and after that there was a lot of conversation of, obviously it was always the plan to have Kenny Omega become the Impact World Champion, the bout collector, all that kind of stuff. That plan has been in motion since Omega made his Impact Wrestling debut last December, just after he won the AEW World Championship. The evidence is there in terms of reports that have been out, and also, if you go back and watch those early promos with Kenny Omega on Impact Wrestling, he starts talking about collecting championships, collecting titles, all that kind of stuff. It's very apparent, isn't it, that the plan was to have Kenny Omega win the Impact World Championship at some point. So when it comes to Rich Swann, I never felt it was a case of, oh, he dropped the title because he's leaving Impact. I never felt like that. But there was a discussion, there was certainly a lot of discussion of, after he dropped the World Championship to Kenny Omega, he essentially disappeared from Impact Wrestling television, and it led a lot of people to say, well, the information is out there that his contract expires in May of 2021. He signed with Impact Wrestling, or signed a new deal with Impact it was May of 2019. And usually with Impact Wrestling, these are 2 or 3 year deals. And I think in Rich Swann's case, it was a 2-year deal. So it led to a lot of people saying, well, maybe he's not on Impact Wrestling television anymore because he's a free agent. Well, that, of course, all changed at Impact Under Siege, because at Impact Under Siege, W. Morrissey defeated Willie Mack. And after the match, W. Morrissey's beating the hell out of Willie Mack. And then who comes to his rescue but the former Impact World Champion, Willie Mack's best friend, Rich Swann. So one could argue maybe Rich Swann has signed a new contract with Impact Wrestling, or at the very least, he's come to some form of an agreement whereby until his contractual situation is sorted with Impact, until he agrees on an extension, what an extension will look like, I don't know. Until that's all sorted, he's still happy to make appearances for Impact or work on a per appearance deal or something like that. Personally, I don't see any benefit of Rich Swann really going anywhere else, if I'm going to be honest with you. Does he go back to WWE? No, he doesn't. Yes, he's a former Cruiserweight champion, but, I mean, why would you... You could go to NXT and be involved in that Cruiserweight division, I suppose. Rich Swann versus Kushida would be a lot of fun, and Rich Swann maybe versus Santos Escobar, even though I think Escobar's moving into the North American Championship scene right now. He could go back there and go to NXT, but realistically, would he be in a better position than he is right now? I mean, he's competing for world championships in Impact Wrestling. He's a former world champion. Is he going to become an NXT champion? No. Is he going to go to the main roster and compete for even the Intercontinental United States Championship? He's just not, because WWE have their perception of who and what Rich Swann is in terms of his level on the card. He has his ceiling there, and I don't think he would want to go back there. So then you go, well, could he go to AEW? Again, he could, and I know I sound a bit like a broken record when it comes to talking about Impact stars going to AEW, but if I'm an Impact Wrestling star, even someone like Rich Swann, who was the Impact World Champion, he did have a great match with Kenny Omega, I look at that roster and I go, where do I fit? And how am I going to be presented? How am I going to be positioned on that show? If I'm a former Impact World Champion, you could say it's maybe slightly naive, but you'd at least hope that you go onto that card with a little bit of momentum and you go in at a reasonably high level and you can start competing against some great stars. Does that happen with Rich Swann? I don't think it does. I think, like a lot of people, when they get signed by AEW, that maybe work for Impact or whoever, he gets put into a faction, and then it's kind of a case of, well, figure it out. We'll find something for you in the future. If I'm Rich Swann and I look at my options right now, I say Impact's the best place for me. I was a world champion there. I can be a world champion once again in the future. I still think the jury is a bit out on how that championship reign went for him. I think he stepped up. There's no doubt about that. And I think with Rich Swann, there's probably an element of loyalty to him as well. I mean, he suffered a real bad injury at the beginning of 2020 or the end of 2019. When he had the ankle injury, and there was concern that he might never wrestle again, and then he had the fantastic angle with Eric Young that caught fire and led to him becoming the Impact World Champion, was one of the hottest angles in Impact Wrestling, and he stepped up during that whole time, and I just look at that and I say to myself, why would you want to leave? Why would you want to leave that? And there is a possibility that he could be the guy to beat Kenny Omega for the Impact World Championship. I don't think so. I think that'll probably be Moose, but even when and if Moose wins the Impact World Championship, Rich Swann could be the guy to face him, because Rich Swann did defeat Moose at Sacrifice to unify the Impact and TNA World Heavyweight Championships. So who's to say that Rich Swann won't become the Impact World Champion again? So whilst his contract either has expires or expires in the next couple of days, it looks like he's agreed something with the company, and I think he'll stay. Ultimately, I think he'll stay, and I think that's the right move for Rich Swann. Now, speaking of Moose, we just spoke about him there. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about Moose, and we've discussed his contract to great lengths here on the channel, so I'm not going to dither on this one too much. But the facts are, at this point, that Moose's contract does expire in June of 2021. He said that on a tweet. He said that his aim was to win the Impact World Championship before his contract expired. We spoke about the options available to him, WWE, AEW, all that kind of stuff. Then it was reported by Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. The expectation was that Moose is going to stay with Impact. They then reported this on F4W Online, saying Moose had signed a new contract. Moose quote tweeted this and said, "That's not accurate. Don't believe everything you read. If you want news, come to me. Unless it comes from me, don't believe it." I'm paraphrasing there, but that's essentially what it was. Like I said before, I think if the expectation is there that Moose is going to stay, I think at this point he will stay. Maybe it's just a case of he hasn't signed a new deal yet, but he's very close to. For me, the expectation is that he will stay, and if he stays, he's the guy to beat Kenny Omega and become the Impact World Champion in the future. I think it's as simple as that. So whilst his contract may still expire in June, and maybe he hasn't signed a new one, I think there's a potential that he has, and he's trying to not spoil an upcoming storyline or storyline direction for Moose in Impact Wrestling. So I think maybe that's the reason why, and he wants to keep people guessing. That's part of the fun of pro wrestling, to work the crowd, and when there isn't a crowd in attendance, there's a crowd on social media, so you've got to work them instead. So I think Moose stays, and I think either he has signed a new deal or he's going to be very close to. Now, some other names that we probably haven't spoken about here before is Rhino. Rhino's contract expires in July, so a couple of months' time. Now, this is an interesting one because currently Rhino's one half of the Impact World Tag Team Champions. He's with the faction Violent by Design. Of course, he's there with Joe Doring, Dina, and also being led by Eric Young. Now, I fully expect Rhino to stay with Impact, to be honest with you. I think the only reason Rhino would leave Impact Wrestling is that Impact Wrestling decided that they didn't want to use Rhino anymore, and I don't see that happening. I think the Violent by Design faction in Impact Wrestling has a ton of potential. even though Eric Young is currently out with an injury with that torn ACL and he's not going to be in the ring again probably for the remainder of this year. If he gets back in before the end of the year, it'll be a rapid recovery by Eric Young. But I think you have to look at all of the storylines and opportunities available for Rhino in Impact Wrestling. Yes, he's the tag team champions with Joe Doring right now. That's going to play out. Violent by Design, I think their story has barely begun in Impact Wrestling. I think we could get to a point at some point this year where maybe, again, it depends when Eric Young returns from injury, but you could get to a point maybe by the end of the year or the start of next year where Violent by Design are holding all of the male championships in Impact Wrestling. You could see a situation where it's Rhino and Joe Doring holding the Impact Tag Team Championships, Dina holding the X Division Championship, and then maybe Eric Young holding the Impact World Championship again. You have to factor in Heath's going to come back at some point, and Heath was meant to win that Call Your Shot gauntlet match, but he got injured, but Rhino won it, and then the plan was to cash in once Heath returned, and Rhino and Heath were going to be a tag team and go after the Tag Team Championship. Of course, Rhino used it for Violent by Design. Rhino turned heel. What does Heath think of that? So maybe Heath comes back and he feuds with Rhino, or possibly they team back up again. There's loads of opportunities available for real fun and creative stories, and you have to remember when it comes to Rhino was under contract with WWE. His contract expired, and he said to WWE, look, I don't want to re-sign. They offered him more money. They offered him a raise, and essentially they offered him a raise to sit at home. This is in 2019, when WWE were flushed with all of this money because of the Saudi deal, because of the television rights with Fox and the USA Network or NBC Universal. All of this stuff was going on, and they were actively signing people to contracts, keeping them at home to keep them away, primarily from AEW. They were hoarding talent. They were offering people raises to stay at home because they didn't want them to go to AEW. Now, did they think Rhino was going to go to AEW and set the world on fire? I doubt it, but they just wanted to hoard talent just in case they could think of something in the future. That's what it was with Rhino at the time. He wasn't even being used, and they offered him money to sit at home. They offered him more money to sit at home, and Rhino said, look, I don't have a ton of time left in the pro wrestling business. I'm a veteran. I've been doing this for a long, long time, and I want to work. I want to earn my money, and I want to wrestle because that's what I enjoy doing. So Rhino decided to turn down a larger contract just to go to Impact Wrestling because he wanted to work. So I think that kind of desire goes rewarded in Impact, and I think he'll stay eventually. I think he'll sign a new contract with Impact. Maybe he has already. Again, with all of this, the stuff we're talking about here, this is just what I've been able to find online. So maybe things have changed, but I expect Rhino fully re-signs because Violent by Design are red hot. Now, another name expiring in July is Kiera Hogan, one half of the current Knockouts Tag Team Champions Fire and Flavor. Now, it was interesting, of course, because this tag team division is essentially kind of being built around this tag team. They were the inaugural Knockouts Tag Team Champions, dropped the titles after winning them at Hard to Kill, dropped the titles at Rebellion to Rachel Ellering and Jordan Grace, and then, shockingly, only a couple of weeks later, win them back at Impact Under Siege. So they're already two-time Knockouts Tag Team Champions. To be honest, and again, this might be a kind of a recurring theme here by I expect him to stay, all this kind of stuff. I don't see the benefit of Kiera Hogan going anywhere else. Obviously, she could go to WWE, and WWE arguably has the best women's division in the world, not maybe on Raw and SmackDown, certainly on NXT, but you have to look at some of the things that Kiera Hogan has said about WWE, specifically Sasha Banks. There is points of contention there. There are feuds there, if you will. There certainly is heat. Kiera Hogan has said some things about Sasha Banks, and she's claimed that Sasha Banks stole her look or tried to rip her off or was viewing her stories, or they all know each other. There was some things said. I'm not sure if Sasha Banks has really responded to it, but WWE would be more than aware of that. And on top of that, Kiera Hogan has said, look, you don't need to go to WWE to make it nowadays. You can make a good living. You can make an impact, pun intended, in the pro wrestling industry by staying with Impact Wrestling or doing other shows or working with other promotions. Could Kiera Hogan go to AEW? Yes, but let's face it, there isn't a tag team division in terms of women's wrestling in AEW. The women's division is improving in AEW. I think the talent's there. The talent's always been there for the AEW women's division. It's all about the perception of women's wrestling in AEW. That's the problem. It's about the opportunities that are given. We've only ever had one main event, women's main event in AEW history in terms of being on Dynamite or pay-per-view. Just one AEW women's main event on Dynamite or pay-per-view isn't good enough. So if I'm Kiera Hogan, I'm looking at this saying, look, we've got the Knockouts tag team division is going great here. We've got legitimate tag teams in there, whether it's Fire and Flavor, whether it's Jordan Grace, Rachel Ellering, whether it's Taylor Wilde and Tenille Dashwood, maybe the Iconics come in as well. All of these teams possibly that are emerging in the Knockouts tag team division. Plus, Knockouts wrestling, women's wrestling means something in Impact Wrestling. It really does. So to me, I think it's a no-brainer that she'll re-sign, to be honest. Again, she could go to AEW, but I'm not necessarily sure I see that. I believe is that Kiera Hogan's partner is Diamante, who of course is signed to AEW. So maybe there is that connection too. Who knows? But I think the best option for Kiera Hogan would be to re-sign with Impact Wrestling. And to be honest, I fully expect her to do that. Now, this is a big name. Now we get into 2022 names. So we're looking already forward to next year. But Josh Alexander, his contract expires in February 2022. Now, I know what some of you may be saying at this point. You're going, yeah, but that's 2022. And it is a long time away, and especially in the world of pro wrestling, in the terms of, life. In reality, we're not talking a ton of time, especially once you get towards the end of this year. Once you get towards the end of this year, once we start getting into like December or something, then you start saying, wait a minute, his contract's coming up in a couple of months. And I think Impact realizes this now, that they need to almost... less than a year out, they almost need to start convincing someone like Josh Alexander that Impact's the place to stay. Because let's face it, Ethan Page is in AEW, and the expectation, I suppose, maybe in AEW, certainly in pro wrestling fans on social media, is that once Josh Alexander's contract expires with Impact, he'll sign with AEW and the North will be reunited. Because the North are one of the best tag teams in the world, and tag teams like FTR and the Young Bucks and all of those great tag teams, the Lucha Brothers, like the list goes on and on of those amazing tag teams in Impact, in AEW rather, they all want to work with the North because the North are that great. They're the longest reigning Impact tag team champions in the promotion's history, 2-time Impact tag team champions. They're just fantastic. The chemistry is off the charts. The matches are off the charts. Everyone obviously would want to work with the North, and that's to be expected. And like I said, the expectation almost is that once Josh Alexander's contract expires, he'll link up with Ethan Page. Personally, I don't think it's that cut and dry. And like I said, I think Impact Wrestling have already begun the overtures to try and get Josh Alexander to stay. And I think that's why Josh Alexander is the X Division champion right now. I think that's the reason why I wouldn't be surprised if Josh Alexander's mixing it up in that main event scene very, very soon, and maybe even cashing in the X Division Championship to challenge for the Impact World Championship. All of that, I think, is by design. I think Josh Alexander can be a world champion in Impact Wrestling. I think Josh Alexander can be main events in Impact Wrestling. I think Josh Alexander is the guy that Impact Wrestling can build the company around. He's a fantastic worker. You could make, discussions and arguments about promos or charisma. I think that's developing. And I think Impact Wrestling realized that if we make Josh Alexander a good enough offer, maybe, obviously financially, but also in terms of creative, we want to give you the World Championship. We want to build the company around you. That's very tempting. Maybe the finances will be better in AEW, and maybe the matches of teaming back up with Ethan Page will be better in AEW. I don't know. It's a tough one. It's a very tough one. Josh Alexander has already been asked about it in interviews, and he's kind of said, "Well, who's to say I would go to AEW? Maybe I'll stay in Impact Wrestling. If I never team with Ethan Page again, it's not the end of the world because I've got aspirations to be a single star." And you have to remember, Ethan Page and Josh Alexander, before they teamed up as the North in Impact, they were single stars. This isn't a tag team that always teamed together. They were single stars put together, and they became a great tag team. They had great chemistry. Who's to say that they will come back together ever again? I think they will at some point, but is it after Josh Alexander's contract expires in 2022 in February? I don't know. I really don't know about that one. I think that one's very debatable. I really do, because I think... Again, if the right offer is made and the creative is there and Impact, and again, this is what they have to achieve at this point, if between now and February of 2022, if they can show Josh Alexander, look, we have plans for you. We believe in you, and we want to give you the World Championship, then I think he will stay. But it's a very tough one, this one. It's a tough one to call, and I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if he goes to AEW, because I think a lot of people want to see the North back together. I think it's ironic, frankly, when it comes to Ethan Page, that he didn't want to do the North split in Impact Wrestling in his final days because he wanted to keep the tag team pure and he didn't want the tag team to turn on each other. So he did the whole Karate Man stuff, which was a disaster. And that wasn't necessarily maybe his fault. There was a lot of creative differences on the whole Karate Man, Ethan Page thing at Hard to Kill earlier this year. But the funny thing about it is that Ethan Page goes into AEW. What's he in already? He's in a tag team. He's in another tag team with Scorpio Sky. So he wanted to keep the tag team pure of the North, but he's already in another tag team in AEW. I don't think he'll necessarily care that much because he's facing Darby Allin and Sting. Yes, Sting at Double or Nothing, which is a huge opportunity for him, isn't it? It's a massive opportunity for Ethan Page. But this one's a tough one. This one's a tough one to call. So I have to wait and see what happens with Josh Alexander. Keeping in with 2022, April of 2022 is Ace Austin. Now, again, it's difficult to say, isn't it? Because now we're talking about, about a year's time, and who knows what will happen in a year's time. A year ago, we were just really getting into the real crux of this pandemic, weren't we? And it was crazy. It was crazy. We'd been like it since March then, and we had no idea what was going to happen. So who knows, frankly, is what is going to happen in 12 months' time. I hope that by the time Ace Austin's contract expires with Impact Wrestling, I hope he has at least one World Championship reign. I think he's too good not to have that. Now, I would be stunned, to be honest. I would be absolutely stunned if by April 2022, WWE and AEW haven't made offers for Ace Austin, because he ticks every box. He really does. I mean, how old is he now? 25? 24? 25? He might even be younger than that. I mean, the amount of talent the guy has for his age, it's the amount of growth that he's going to have is exponential. He's already a multiple-time Impact World Tag Team X Division champion, Super X Cup trophy winner. Again, I think now is the time to start elevating this guy into the main event scene. And I know some people will say, again, promos and stuff like that. I disagree. I think he has total charisma. And this was a guy that last year was the final guy eliminated at Slammiversary. This was the guy, in that elimination, was it 5-way match for the vacant Impact World Championship last year. He was the last guy eliminated. And the discussion going into that match was, is Ace Austin going to become the youngest Impact World Champion in the promotion's history? Obviously, it didn't happen. I don't know if that time frame is now passed, but I think now, given we're heading into the final 12 months of his contract, now I would start saying, if you're Impact, we need to. It's the Josh Alexander situation again. If we're going to keep him, especially in the case of Ace Austin, if we're going to keep him, we need to prove that he can be a world champion. Because let's face it, if they make him a compelling offer that they say, look, you're going to be in main events, Ace Austin's got time. He's got a lot of time, which maybe Josh Alexander doesn't have as much because Josh Alexander is older. But Ace Austin has a ton of time. He's not even in his prime yet. So they could convince him to stick around for 2 more years, because what's 2 more years? If he's 25, 27, he's still wet behind the ears when it comes to his career in pro wrestling. But if they don't, if they're still, X Division Championship, that's great. And don't get me wrong, no disrespect to the lineage of the X Division Championship, but there will be companies like NXT. You could see Ace Austin tomorrow appearing in an NXT ring, because Triple H would love that talent. There's no doubt in my mind. And the same with AEW. They would love to have someone like Ace Austin. He fits the AEW style perfectly. So, I would be very surprised if we haven't seen Ace Austin at least get very close to an Impact World Championship in the next 12 months, because frankly, if they're going to have any chance of keeping him, that's what's going to happen. And I know he's very happy in Impact Wrestling, but 12 months is a long time, and there'll be offers. There's no doubt there'll be offers. And finally, the Good Brothers. Now, the Good Brothers, of course, their contracts expire in July of 2022. Now, obviously, they signed about a year ago, nearly a year ago at this point, just over a year ago. They signed the date of Slammiversary last year, and they signed a 2-year deal with Impact Wrestling. Of course, that contract does allow them to work New Japan dates if they would like. Now, at the time, it was quite surprising that they had signed with Impact Wrestling, because I think the assumption was that they would go to AEW, considering their history with Kenny Omega and Cody Rhodes and the Young Bucks and just everyone there. I mean, obviously, going back for their times in New Japan as part of the Bullet Club, the assumption was that they would sign with AEW, so it was a bit of a surprise that they went to Impact. I think there was concern about some heat at the time between them and the Young Bucks, because obviously there were plans for the Good Brothers to come in for that inaugural episode of Dynamite, that debut episode of Dynamite on TNT, and that was going to lead to AJ Styles signing with the company, and then it was going to be the Elites. It was going to be Omega and the Bucks versus the Good Brothers and AJ Styles. Those creative plans didn't work, because obviously Gallows, Anderson, and Styles all ended up re-signing with WWE. All that kind of stuff was the situation there. And I think there was a bit of residual heat. And whilst the Good Brothers thought it was just business, I think the Young Bucks felt a bit slighted, considering they've just been made, they're EVPs of this new company. And it looks like, you couldn't get the job done. You couldn't re-sign those guys. They felt that they put them in a bad position. But obviously all of that heat's now gone, because the Good Brothers appear on AEW Dynamite Weekly at this point with the Young Bucks, with Kenny Omega, with Don Callis as part of the working relationship between AEW and Impact Wrestling. Frankly, and again, we're talking about over a year's time, so it's difficult to say. I would be really, really surprised if they stuck around, to be honest, with Impact Wrestling. I think the reason they signed with Impact last year, maybe again because there was a bit of residual heat or whatever, but I think mainly it was because they were sort of like, well, we don't want to go to AEW straight away. That's easy. And that's what people expect us to do. We want to do some other things first. We want to have the flexibility to do our own projects, all that kind of stuff, which they would get, frankly, in AEW. But I think they just wanted to keep their distance immediately. But now, at this point, I think it's quite obvious that they'll go to AEW. I think once the contract expires in Impact Wrestling, I think they know where the money is to be made, and obviously the bridges are they're very much welcome there at this point, and they're appearing on there every week. So I think it's almost a case of sort of the Thunder Rosa situation with NWA and AEW. That obviously they're under contract with Impact, but once the contract expires, they'll become exclusive to AEW. They'll still be allowed to do the New Japan stuff like lots of big talents are in AEW, but I wouldn't be surprised if in a year's time the Good Brothers are gone from Impact and they're permanently with AEW. But look, guys, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on all of these upcoming Impact Wrestling talents and when their contracts are set to expire? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll be really interested to see what you guys have to say about all of this. Certainly going to be fascinating. Remember, if you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button too. Really does help us out here on YouTube, go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestling News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right corner of the screen right now. Or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or have you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon. Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.